Welcome to episode 4 of Tales of the Ultimate Sportsman. This episode is a collection of 6 short stories that we think you'll love. Please leave a comment and subscribe, or follow if you want to stay connected with our podcast. Thanks again for watching and listening. See you next time, and remember, have fun but be careful out there.
The Bear by Isaac Fox, mechanical engineering student at UC Davis. My brother and I were out in the Sierras on a backpacking/camping/fishing trip with a few of our friends. Dan, one of our friends, and Kevin, my brother, got up early to fish at a nearby lake. They were about 100 yards apart and at the other end of the lake, so Dan could look across the water and see my brother. The other end of the lake was pretty shallow, and there were tall reeds lining the edges of the water. Kevin had waded through the reeds and was standing in about 1 foot of water using a spinner-type lure, and Dan was on the bank in a clearing between the reeds. I was still at the campsite, keeping the female campers company. I could see the lake through the trees, and it was quiet, so I could hear Dan and Kevin talking to each other across the water. Bear sighting. All of a sudden I heard loud splashing, and Kevin was yelling something about a bear. I jumped up and ran to the lake, where I found Dan standing still watching Kevin sprinting through about 18-inch of water, lure skipping along behind him, screaming, "A bear! A bear!" Soon enough, Kevin joined us on our side of the lake, and between gasps for air, he told us that a bear had been trying to sneak up behind him through the reeds, and that he had barely gotten away from it. We could see the reeds moving across the water, and we watched them warily, until several seconds later a large brown cow emerged from the reeds, cowbell ringing out in the morning air. Dan and I almost died laughing. First Time Fisherman by Todd Craig, Helena, Alabama. The first time my dad took me fishing was when I was about 7 years old. He was renting some farmland in central Alabama, which the Coosa River ran through. He packed up the fishing gear, set my line, gave me a few pointers, then went off to work on the farm. I had the line in the water for only a few minutes when it was hit by a huge, by 7-year-old standards, catfish. I was so excited about catching my first fish that I accidentally reeled the rod in backwards. After I succeeded in creating a permanent backlash, the reel seized. It was at that point that I decided the only way that I'd land the beast was to turn around and run away from the river with the rod, while simultaneously screaming for my dad. This is where the story gets a little fuzzy. Evidently, in the course of running away from the river to beach the monster catfish, I ran into a tree, which knocked me down. I then rolled down the bank, still holding the rod. By the time my dad got there, the catfish, the rod, and I were all lashed together, flopping around on the bank like some slimy monster with 4 bug eyes, wrapped up in fishing line. It took Dad about 15 minutes to cut us all loose. After that, we decided that the fish had been through enough, so we let him go. It was a long time before Dad and I went fishing again, and my dad still can't eat catfish without laughing.
Salty Slime Story by Incognito. My husband and I, and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law all went fishing together in our boat. We women were told that in order to go fishing with the guys, we would have to bait our own hooks and get what fish we caught off of the hooks. Okay, no problem. Well, we got about a quarter-mile offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and dropped anchor. Janelle and I got out the shrimp, and as I baited my hook, Janelle made a yucky face and handed the bait and hook to her husband Jack. We casted our lines out, and within about 5 or so minutes, I got a bite. I very slowly reeled in my line, playing with it to catch the fish, and when I got it above the water, I found out I had hooked an electric eel. Boy, was I upset. I couldn't refuse to take it off of the hook, because I would never live it down with my husband or his brother. I felt like a coward would cut the line. So I didn't know what to do. I turned and asked Jack, my brother-in-law, for some pliers. The first thing he said was, "Don't throw my pliers overboard." I got the eel by the head using the pliers. So far, so good. I stood up so I would be ready to throw the eel overboard as soon as I got him or her off the hook. Then the eel wrapped itself around my arm. Needless to say, everything went overboard. I threw the eel and the pliers as far as I could. Then I told Jack, Not one word, not one word. I'll buy you another pair of $2 pliers. Surprisingly, I had the respect of all my fishing buddies. Jack was surprised that I baited my own hook, and he was very surprised when I refused to ask for help to take the eel off of the hook. My husband was proud of me. Everyone there said they would have cut the line. I was smug for the rest of the day. After I recovered, that is.
Soaking Wet by Todd Craig, Helena, Alabama. After working until midnight one night, I decided I needed some R&R, and what better way to get it but to go fishing. I hurried home, got my pole and gear, jumped into the car, and headed out for the old honey hole. It took about 1/2 of an hour to drive to the lake, and another 30 minutes to hike through the woods, but I wasn't tired, not me. I was going fishing. Finally, I was at the cove I enjoyed so much. Not just any cove, it was my cove. A place where all my troubles seemed to vanish. A place where the big oaks stretched out their branches and provided shade from the hot summer sun. This is the place where all the worries of telecommunications were forgotten. This was going to be a beautiful Carolina summer morning, and I was where I loved to be. I set down my tackle box and fixed the pole for a Carolina rig. I just knew this was going to be a great morning for fishing. I threw my line in and carefully worked the bottom. Nothing, not even a nibble. After about 20 minutes, I decided to put away the lures and tie a night crawler on the line with a floater. After all, I had worked the night shift and was getting a little tired. I threw the line in, then sat back and looked around at the beautiful scenery. As I lay back, gazing up at the sky, I must have dozed off. I awoke to a great splashing sound, and, as I looked up, saw my pole being dragged into the water. I immediately jumped to my feet and dove for the pole, but just missed it. As I stood there watching my favorite pole go deeper, I made the crucial decision not to let it get away. I waded in, feeling the bottom with my feet. Then suddenly I felt it. I leaned down, and sure enough, there was my pole wedged between two rocks. As I picked it up and examined the bent and broken reel, there was a magnificent tug, and the pole flew out of my hands, out into the dark, murky lake. That was the last I would ever see of that pole, or so I thought. A week later, as I was reading the local paper, there on page 3 was a picture of a fellow outdoorsman holding up a 13-pound bass. The caption at the bottom read, "Record bass caught complete with its own pole." As I stared at that picture, I realized that it was my fishing pole in the picture. I found the man's address and went over to explain the story. He never gave me back the pole, and the bass is mounted on his mantle. I go back to that fishing hole a lot with my new friend, Bob. When I look over at him, a smile comes across my face because he's still using that same pole I lost that hot summer day.
The Mississippi Monster by Tim Worel, Silver Creek, Minnesota. A few months ago, I got a call from Gene, a good friend of mine. We try to go hunting at least once a year, but this time Gene wanted to go fishing. I suggested that we try the river, as I had heard that the bass were biting. We got to the river and went to my favorite spot. Right away, we started catching small walleyes, fishing with jigs, minnows, and leeches. One thing about river fishing is that you never know what you might catch. We soon grew tired of catching walleyes and decided to go for smallmouth bass. We anchored in 4 feet of water in an area where the current was moving fast. I got a bite and set the hook, and the fight was on. All I could do was hold on. The monster fish started to rip my line out as if I were not even there. I was just about out of line. So I released my bail in hopes that the monster would turn around and swim upstream. It worked. The monster splashed, turned, and was coming right at the boat. I told Gene, get the net, it's getting close. Then I yelled, get ready, he's coming up. Up came the biggest rubberback turtle we had ever seen. It was too big for the net. Gene and I just looked at each other and then the hook popped off. I had hooked its shell behind the head. As I have said, one thing about river fishing is that you never know what you might catch. The One That Didn't Get Away by Mick Chappell, Ocala, Florida. I remember a particular incident that happened to me about 5 years ago while I was fishing a local pond in Ocala, Florida. It was a hot summer day and I had decided to load my canoe and go do a little largemouth fishing at said pond. I asked my wife to join me and she said she wouldn't fish but instead would go sit by the water and read a book while I fished. With this in mind, I loaded the canoe and off we went. When we got to the pond, I launched the canoe and began paddling across to this one area where a tree had fallen some time ago. This making excellent cover for bass in the hot part of the day. Only problem was that it also made a good hangout for the resident gator that we saw in the pond from time to time. Upon arriving to my hot spot, I prepared my line for fishing, putting on a 4-inch electric grape worm, in which I planned to jig the area with. Well, the first pitch I didn't get it right where I wanted it. So I began to lift the rod tip to drop the lure in another spot, hoping to get a better chance of getting a strike. As I lifted the line, the unexpected happened, and a large bass about 4.5 pounds grabbed my worm. I yanked to set the hook, and when I did, I went completely backwards, dumping the canoe and everything in it, including myself. Well, here I am underwater with canoe and tackle floating everywhere. It happened so fast that all I remember doing was thinking there may be a gator in the water here, and groping for my fishing rod, which I luckily grabbed while coming up for air. Anyway, with rod in hand, I managed to swim the canoe to shore, got out of the water, and began to reel in my line, which to my amazement still had the 4.5-pounder, fighting like a pro, still on the hook. When I looked across the pond to show my wife the fish, she was rolling on the ground laughing at the sight she had just witnessed. I lifted the bass in the air and proceeded to show her. The One That Didn't Get Away.
That's all for episode 4. Thanks for joining us. See you next time on Tales of the Ultimate Sportsman.